Thank you all for being here, and a special thanks to the conference organizers for their efforts in putting together this event. I'm going to shift our gaze to the humanities with the coming panels in view. Cariton, one of the ancient authors whose work I'll be referencing today, prefaces his novel with the phrase, "Eros delights in paradox." That is, that romantic love delights in paradox. The novels that I'll be discussing today dramatize a particular fundamental paradox of Eros, which is the paradox between violence and sexual pleasure. Now, not only is this paradox central to the novels that I'll be discussing, but it's also thoroughly gendered in that both the enduring promise of pleasure and the imminent threat of pain converge on the side of the female body in these novels. The works listed here constitute the 5 extant Hellenistic novels written, as you can see, between 50 BCE and 380 CE. Each of these novels follows a similar stock plot. A young, chaste couple falls in love and fate wills for them to be together, but they're separated and removed from the home into the wider world, where the heroine is subjected to a series of violent onslaughts, including various combinations of kidnapping, attempted rape, fake death, physical abuse, and enslavement. Through all these myriad physical and psychological traumas, the anticipation of pleasure prompts the heroine's endurance of pain. In the end, they marry and live happily ever after. The plot is aptly summarized by an 18th century editor of one of these novels who says that Chaereas and Calirrhoe are extremely unfortunate, but then they're virtuous. If at this point you're inclined to imagine a distressed maiden draped across Fabio on the cover of a Harlequin romance, you are not entirely incorrect. These novels were disregarded for centuries as being lowbrow popular literature. But after centuries of relative obscurity, the novels reemerge in the 16th century, influencing authors such as Edmund Spenser and John Lyly. However, the 18th century represents perhaps the most significant era in the novel's reception for a number of reasons. First, production of the novels reaches its peak in the 18th century, with the highest numbers of new publications and reprints of older translations disseminated throughout England and continental Europe. I've listed some of them here. Additionally, in previous centuries, the novels had been adapted into poetic verse during translation, but the 18th century marks the first time that they're popularized in their original prosaic form. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the 18th century marks the birth of the modern English novel. But it's more than just the novelistic form that the 18th century novels have in common with the ancient novels. In a similar fashion to their ancient predecessors, the 18th century novels deliberately associate feminine sexual vulnerability with sexual pleasure. Here, I've listed 4 English novels which represent some of the earliest popular works in domestic, sentimental, and Gothic fiction. Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield reaches its narrative climax when one female protagonist is presumed dead and the other abducted. In The Castle of Otranto, Walpole concludes his novel with a case of mistaken identity that results in the heroine's stabbing. And perhaps the most overt example of fetishized violence in literature of the time, Richardson's novels subject Clarissa and Pamela to abduction, physical abuse, and sexual assault, which in Clarissa's case results in her untimely death. As you can see, this leaves us with a similar narrative matrix to that of the ancient novels. So how do we account for the interweaving of sex and violence on the side of the female body in the romance novel? There are a number of converging factors that account for this, but I'll limit my exploration to one that I find particularly compelling. Both the ancient and early modern novel were born out of eras of socio-political unrest, in which concerns about sex, marriage, and procreation were brought to the fore. Legislature known as the Lex Julia was crucial in setting the stage for the Hellenistic novels. Instituted by Augustus in 18 BCE, this legislation incentivized marriage and childbearing between noble freeborn citizens and instituted severe public and private punishment for adultery. Increasingly, social order was considered to be rooted in the relationship between husband and wife, particularly those of high social standing. In the midst of these changing attitudes toward marriage, the Greek romance novel elevates marriage as the locus of erotic passion. The preoccupation with fidelity and chastity in the ancient novel insists that both erotic fulfillment and social obligation can be found in marriage. Likewise, the 18th century saw the institution of Lord Hardwicke's 1753 Marriage Act, which was the primary legislative impetus against illicit marriages, which were increasingly generating scandals and disputes about inheritance and property law. The law was a subject of debate amongst authors of the time, even inspiring John Shebbear's 1754 satirical novel, The Marriage Act, which is subtitled, "A Novel in which the ruin of female honor, the contempt of the clergy, the destruction of public and private property, along with other fatal consequences considered, a series of interesting adventures." He's obviously very concerned. Amidst this legislative shift, the 18th century romances offered their readers a fictional domestic enclave as an alternative to these raging power struggles. Literary critics of the 18th century perceived romance as a genre for women, assuming that the readership was predominantly female since the earliest inception of the genre. Changing social and economic conditions for women in the 18th century facilitated this growth in female readership. Similarly, scholars have argued that a female readership emerged out of the rise in literacy under Augustinian rule, and the romance novel was particularly popular amongst this rising group of readers. Thus, the romance novel became a lens through which many women perceived their own bodies and the relationship between their sexuality and the broader community. The association between sex and violence thus served a didactic function in romance literature, presenting the loss of life as a favorable alternative to the loss of purity, and the safety of the home as a favorable alternative to the chaos of the broader world. Romance literature continues to shape and reflect popular conceptions of gender and sexuality, as it has since the ancient novels were penned in the 2nd century. The intermingling of violence and sexual pleasure persists even in current popular romance literature, evinced in the last 10 years in book series such as 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight. I believe that modern literary representations of gender and sexuality owe more to the ancient novel than has been historically recognized, whether being used to perpetuate the policing of female bodies or to subvert that theme as it's been used historically. And the 18th century romance novel is an important waypost in understanding broader receptions of the ancient novel, even in our own time. Thank you very much.